My approach to composition, that's a very interesting question, and I'll try to keep brief on it. Um, I think it depends what I'm writing.
Okay.
I would say that I'm a more traditional composer in methodology when I'm writing something that's tonal or quasi-tonal.
Okay.
At those times, I tend to rely a little bit on the piano as a tool, even though I'm not composing. And of course, with computers, as they came into my life later on, I may have started just replacing a computer's ability to play things back, not being a pianist. But I would still sit down, especially if it's tonal oriented.
Yeah.
I sit at the piano and I play. I'm a very functional piano player. So as long as I'm working on it, I can get through things in a good functional way. And if it's functional harmony and all of that stuff, I still find it a little easier to sit down at the piano and compose that way. But whenever it moves away from traditional tonality in any shape or form, I tend to write without the aid of anything. So in general, I write things by hearing it in my head, knowing what it is, and simply writing it down on paper. But that process is a fairly interesting one as well. I would say when I started, I would sit at the piano a lot. And as I got older, I used the piano less and less. I used my trombone a lot too. I think I got into composing through arranging when I was younger, because I would sit and play my favorite things like Chicago or Blood, Sweat, and Tears with my trombone and the record, the LP. And I would say, I'd learn all the trombone parts. Then I'd say, well, what's a saxophone doing? So I'd just start playing with the saxophone. So I probably drove my mother crazy sitting in my bedroom, and I would just keep playing passages over on the record and just keep playing along with it. Which reminds me that in that high school thing, my high school director, one of the pieces he arranged was 25 or 6/4 by Chicago, which is not at all a jazz tune, and we played that at a jazz festival, and someone compared me at that time. I was playing trombone, of course. I had a big solo in it, and the solo was really based on the guitar solo in that piece. So, but after that was over, I had another solo, another piece. The guest judge, who was a very well-known trombonist, compared me to Irby Green.
Really?
And I didn't even know who Irby Green was. And my director really didn't know who Irby Green was either. So we did a little research and found out that he was this fantastic New York trombonist who later became very well-known for playing on the Lawrence Welk Band, even though that's not a jazz group. Anyway, it's kind of interesting, but that's how I did it. Getting back to the composition, I guess what I would say is that today I do most of my composing in a train, a plane, a car, or sitting in an airport. Because that's when I have the most time to compose. And so you can imagine that I'm not doing any of that with an instrument around me. And so basically these days I think through an entire piece in my head, and when the piece is completed I sit down and write it all down. So I don't make sketches, I don't make drafts, I don't write it piece by piece. I just sort of work through the whole piece in my head and then sit down one day and write it on paper.
That's interesting.
So that's if I have to work a piece out. I have also heard pieces in my dreams and get up sometimes in the middle of the night and go into my office and start writing them down. And sometimes they just come to me in a flash walking down a hallway. I remember I was teaching a class on minimalism when I first started teaching at Capital University. And after class that night, on the way from the classroom to my office, which was a very short walk, I just started humming this little minimal motive. And from the time I walked from that classroom to the time I got to my office, I had heard in my head an entire 20-minute composition. And I sat down on one little piece of manuscript paper and wrote out the form and the motives and how everything was going to come together. And the next day I came in and wrote the whole 20-minute composition.
That's crazy. Do you just, I mean, are you just thinking about like the melody and then you put other parts to it once you sit down and write it, or is it?
No, I think it's much more explosive than that. I think I literally hear, it's kind of like the Big Bang Theory. No, it's like the Big Bang Theory.
Okay.
It's just like all of a sudden I just hear the whole piece in its entirety.
Really? Huh.
Yeah, one night, this is a good example. One night I was sitting at my computer, and a good friend from Capitol, the saxophone instructor, Michael Cox, had commissioned me to write a piece that he was going to perform in the fall on a whole evening of premieres.
Okay.
And he was premiering a piece by a very well-known big-name composer that was going to be premiered by something like 100 saxophonists, either all on the same night or all in the same week across the nation. And that was the concert that he had asked me to write a piece for. But it was getting very close. I think it was about 3 weeks away or something, and I hadn't had one of these ideas. And so I really hadn't written anything. And he calls me and he says, I need to send something in, and so I need the title of your piece and some other information on it so that we can get the commission money.
Yeah.
And I really thought I was going to have to tell him that I hadn't come up with any ideas at all for the piece, and that I was going to have to cancel, which I had never ever done before.
Right.
And fortunate for me, Michael talks a lot because he just kind of stream of thought, and he was talking, and we weren't really talking about the piece so much as other things. And for some reason, while he was talking, one word came into my head. He's a fantastic jazz performer, and the word that came into my head was bebop. And I kind of kept hearing the word bebop, and then that being a 2-syllable word, for some reason, and I don't know why, another 2-syllable word popped into my head, and that's voodoo. And as soon as the second word popped into my head, I literally heard an entire composition based on those 2 words.
Wow.
So Michael was just kind of droning away in the background talking. I hadn't been listening to him now for probably a minute.
Yeah.
And I said, Michael, I got to hang up right now. The title is Bebop Voodoo. It'll be on your desk in the morning. Goodbye.
That's crazy.
And I mean, from that moment forward, I just put my pencil to paper, because I was writing on paper at the time, and I just sketched out the whole piece, which is, again, another 20-minute piece. But I literally heard everything as soon as I heard Bebop Voodoo.
Wow, that's amazing.
That I knew what the whole piece was going to be.
Yeah.
And so that kind of, I don't know why that happens to me, but it does. And there are other composers. You know, Mozart never wrote sketches.
Yeah.
We think that that's probably how he wrote and heard music in his head.
Really interesting.
And I'm not comparing myself to Mozart.
Oh, no.
But all composers, I think, have, some very meticulously work it out.
Yeah.
I don't do that. When I'm done with a piece, I'm done. I don't go back and revise it. I'd rather just write the next piece.
Gotcha.
And because of that, I have a pretty large library, probably around 300 compositions.
Okay.
All have been performed. I only write for performance.
Okay.
I don't write just to write. So that's a little bit, and that's probably the most I can tell you about.
No.
It's kind of a mystery to me, too. I don't know
That's really
how it all works.
interesting. I never would have expected that. That's really cool.